We're going to begin in Alberta, where Premier Danielle Smith is rejecting the federal government's plan for a clean power grid by 2035, calling it, quote, unconstitutional, irresponsible, and utterly out of step with reality. The Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, joins me. Premier, welcome back to Power and Politics.
Thanks for having me.
The federal government, Premier Smith, has given provinces 75 days to respond to its draft clean electricity regulations. What feedback will Alberta be giving?
The same feedback that I've been giving to Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault and Justin Trudeau, Jonathan Wilkinson, and Dominic LeBlanc every time I've met with them is that these aggressive targets that seem to have been pulled out of the air are just not achievable for Alberta. We recognize that other provinces are in a bit of a different position with their power grid. Our power grid is 90% natural gas. We're just going to need a little bit more time to reach 2050 targets. And we hope that they'll be working with us to make sure we can do that.
So is the 2050 date versus the 2035 the wholesale rejection of that schedule? Because the minister stated when he brought these in last week that he had specifically listened to Alberta, sought to strike a balance and be flexible with exemptions to bring you in. Not sufficient?
No, he did not. I think one of the things we have to remember is that we aggressively went off coal many years prior to the original target. There was even one coal company that had to retool their plant 6 months after they'd opened because of the surprise changes to the rules. And it's cost our ratepayers billions of dollars. We're still paying that off for the stranded assets. Now to do the same thing for our natural gas plants, I just don't think that's reasonable. It's not going to result in affordability. It's not going to result in reliability. And the provisions that the minister has put forward would essentially allow for gas plants to run about 18 days a year. And that is not going to be enough to be able to back up wind and solar, which are far more unreliable and more intermittent than that.
So look at those clauses with me, if you would, exactly to that last point you were making, because as I was looking at the draft regulations, you had sought to have natural gas plants used beyond 2035. And again, as you look at these drafts, gas plants with carbon capture technology can keep operating. Units can keep operating. If they're operational by 2025, they'd be exempt for 20 years. So that would continue into the 2040s. They could continue even without carbon capture. Peaker plants, you've spoke of that, just referencing there, they would be allowed to operate beyond 2035 at times when consumer demand is highest. So are these not the provisions that you have been calling for? And I'm wondering where the discrepancy is.
Well, the discrepancy is the limitation on the hours. He says that they can only operate 450 hours or to 150,000 tons. And in fact, that might be even less than the number of hours that has been prescribed. And we have to remember that our grid, part of the reason we've been able to add wind and solar on is that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, the natural gas peaker plants come on. When I looked at the numbers for 2022, solar operates about 13% of the time. Wind operates about 33% of the time. So that's not going to be anywhere near enough to make sure that we've got a reliable grid. And that's got to be our number one goal, is to make sure that we don't end up with rolling blackouts. So we need to do a bit more work to see if we can come to an agreement on that.
So is that your approach right now? How will you proceed then if there is the gap as you've laid out? How will you continue to work with the federal government?
Well, our feedback to the federal government was we are happy to align with a 2050 target. We think that's reasonable. We think that's realistic. We think that allows for us to work with our neighbors in British Columbia and Manitoba to see if we can bring in transmission lines so that we can use hydro. We think that's enough time to develop a regulatory framework for small modular nuclear, which will be rolling out at the end of this decade. We think that that will allow us to perfect carbon capture utilization and storage technology. But these things can't be done at the drop of a hat. It's 12 short years that they're proposing to be able to have all of this in place. That's just simply not enough time. But we have talked with our power generators, and they think that 2050 is a reasonable amount of time. We've got to be mindful of that, and we've got to make sure that we're putting forward policies that are realistic rather than fairy tales. And unfortunately, what has been pulled out of the air here, it doesn't make sense for our province, and that's the reason why we're going to be charting a course to 2050.
Yes, fairy tales, you said at your news conference earlier today, utterly out of step with reality, irresponsible is how you've characterized these draft regulations. And you also used today the word that you used on a couple of occasions in the statement you released last week, and that is unconstitutional. Previously, you have said if Ottawa issues laws and regulations you consider unconstitutional, you will invoke the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Is that what you're signaling here?
Well, I can tell you that I look at the Constitution not as an advisory document. It's how our country is supposed to work. The act that I passed in the fall was to let the federal government know that we would be defending our areas of constitutional jurisdiction. And it says right there in Section 92A that we are going to allow for electricity generation to be the exclusive domain of the provinces. There's a reason for that. We all have different natural endowments, we have different geography, we've got different priorities, we've got different abilities. And so I think that the federal government should take it as a win that we want to work with them on 2050 and not try to be unrealistic in trying to advance a proposal that is going to be extraordinarily costly. We estimate $200 to $400 billion and likely unachievable. I think that they should work with us so that we can achieve the objective that they want to seek by 2050.
Just to be clear on the Sovereignty Act, have you at this point instructed or will you instruct the province's lawyers to look into this on this matter right now?
Well, we just signed terms of reference with the federal government to come to the table for 8 to 12 months to see how we can get into alignment. I'm going to go into that with good intentions and with good faith in hoping that they are reasonable and that they are going to meet us part way. At the moment, I've been disappointed that despite all of the feedback that we've given them, that they have not met us where we need to be. And so I'll see how that process plays out, but we've got a little bit of time to be able to negotiate. And I'm hopeful that once they see our modeling and once they see the reality, that they're going to work with us on 2050.
In addition to the Sovereignty Act, though, I'm wondering, are you looking at any other legal challenges and what legal basis you would have for those, any other constitutional arguments? You mentioned Section 92 of the Constitution, for example. Are there other options you'd explore legally?
Well, look, I mean, there's lots of things that we can do in our province. We've been managing our electricity grid without the federal government's help or oversight ever since our founding, and we're going to continue managing our electricity grid. That's what I have a mandate to do, is to make sure that we have reliable, affordable energy. People need to know when they flick the switch that the lights are going to come on. They need to have some confidence when it's minus 30 that we're not going to have intermittent power and a failing power grid. And those are the things that I have as my mandate. Those are the things that the Constitution gives me the obligation to do. And so we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that we achieve those objectives.
I just wonder if raising the word constitutional and signaling rather potential legal arguments isn't moot at this point, because none of the regulations, as you yourself indicate, they won't be coming into effect for a dozen years, and there's nothing official to challenge. So they can't be challenged in court until there's something in law to challenge.
That's not quite true. I mean, they're anticipating that all of this is going to begin to take effect as of January of 2025. My understanding is that they're not going to allow any unabated natural gas to come onto the grid unless it's been put in place beforehand. That means anybody who's conceiving of a project today has to operate under the new rules. It's just not possible to get something conceived and built within essentially a 16 or 18 month time frame. So these are real and present. It's going to have a real and meaningful impact on our investment climate. We're already seeing it. I look at my grid of the number of projects that are backed up for approval, and there's 23,000 megawatts of wind and solar and virtually no baseload. That's already an indication to me that the federal government's chill on investment is having a major impact on us. And so we're going to have to find a way to make sure we get more baseload power. That's got to be our #1 target.
When you mention chill on investment, that has been the concern raised by many within the renewables industry after the pause or the moratorium on large-scale renewable energy projects instituted just a few days ago until the end of February 2024. If it's impossible, as you say, to achieve a clean grid in Alberta by 2035, you are at the same time pausing the renewable sector, which could help move you in that direction. Do you see an inconsistency there?
I don't. I mean, if you look at the 7 times that our power grid almost failed in the last year, on 2 of those days, when it was minus 30, wind and solar were generating less than 100 megawatts of power, even though there's 5,000 megawatts of installed. If I had 10 or 20 or 30,000 megawatts of installed solar and wind, and the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, it's not going to produce any more power. That's the reason why wind and solar have always had to have natural gas as a backup in our province, because they're unreliable. And if we can't bring on a significant amount of natural gas to completely back up wind and solar when they're not working, then that's the problem that we're facing with the federal government. They have to understand reality, that wind and solar investment in this province is dependent on being able to ensure we have baseload.
wind and solar investment in the province has been outstripping elsewhere in the country. It's been booming. And then some of the criticism from within industry about what has happened as a result of the moratorium, that thousands of jobs are at risk, billions of dollars of investment both now, and perhaps a shaking of confidence for the investment climate in the future. What fallout from this pause do you anticipate?
Well, look, other provinces have been able to decarbonize their grid with baseload power. In Ontario and Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia, they rely on hydroelectric. In Ontario, it's nuclear. There's no province that is conceiving of building out a power grid entirely reliant on wind and solar intermittent power. That would be absurd for a province to do that, quite frankly. The only way you can bring on a reasonable amount of solar and wind is to make sure that you've got baseload backup. And at the moment, we don't have anybody proposing those projects. And I think it's because the federal government has created so much uncertainty. That's what we've got to address. And as soon as we're able to address that, come to terms, then we're going to be able to take the pause off, and people will know what the rules are for where they site their projects, how they have to make sure that it stays off of prime agriculture land. And they're going to have rules around reclamation, because these are massive projects. If you look at one solar farm in southern Alberta, it takes up 3,200 acres of land. If you look at a wind project, at 47 turbines, the size of the CN Tower or the Calgary Tower, like these are significant projects with massive liability costs for reclamation, and we don't have a framework for how we're going to see those cleaned up. So it would be irresponsible of me not to make sure that everybody knows the rules, and that's what we need to do.
Those are the same concerns. Same concerns when oil and gas was taking off and booming in the province in terms of reclamation. We know what has been left from abandoned oil wells, for example, but there was never a moratorium announced in the expansion of oil and gas, even as it boomed, and there were problems, and you sought regulation. At no time was there a pause. Do you believe that renewables will ever become the dominant form of energy in Alberta?
No, they can't. I mean, we have, when we get down to minus 30 and we have a heavy air mass over our province, the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. You can't be in a situation where you're relying 100% on intermittent power. We have to bring baseload power on. Now, wind and solar, I think, are complementary as long as they've got natural gas backing them up so that they can work in tandem together. But we also have made, we've made policy in our province where we're demanding that our oil and natural gas companies clean things up. They have to clean up 3% per year of their liability. So we've already addressed that. Why would we want to make the same mistake that previous governments have made in not holding wind and solar to a similar accountable standard?
Is part of your planning at all presently, or your calculation for the future, Premier Smith, the possibility of a Pierre Poilievre government in 2 years?
You know what, I have to deal with the government that's there, and from everything I can see, they're intending to stay on for the next 2 years. And so I owe it to Albertans to work with the federal government to come up with a plan that will allow us to achieve our joint objectives. 2050 is a reasonable target, and we want to invest in carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen, geothermal, as well as make sure that as nuclear develops, that we have a framework for us to bring that on the grid here too. I mean, we're working in the same direction. It's just a matter of the time frame. And so I think that we can come to an agreement as long as the federal government remains reasonable.